Genshin Impact players, this character is more than just a tool for badminton. Nahida is an amazing and versatile unit, and she has so many different ways you can play her. So today I want to talk about 5 of the best and most fun ways to play Nahida in Genshin Impact. In this video, we're going to talk about those teams, how to play them, and some substitutes for characters that you might not have. Keep in mind some of the rotations I'm going to show you today may not be perfectly accurate for every single situation, but they should give you a general idea of how to play the teams. If you enjoy these types of videos, make sure to subscribe down below. It helps me out a lot, and I would love if we could get to 150k before the end of the year. Oh, and check out my Twitch. With all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Nahida's teams. The first team that I'm going to be showcasing today is a Nilou Bloom team. This one features Nilou, Nahida, Kokomi, and Xingqiu, focusing on using Hydro and Dendro plus Nilou's buff to spam Dendro core damage. However, sort of keeps doing this thing where they release characters that will be good a few patches down the line, and Nilou was a perfect example of that. Nilou is 100% meant to be played with Nahida. She has insane Dendro uptime, Bloom buffs, and more to offer Nilou teams. Now that we have solid Dendro uptime from a character, we can run 3 Hydro characters and 1 Dendro to try and control who's activating blooms in bloom-based teams. Though Nahida won't always be the trigger, most of the time you will have an underlying Hydro aura, which at the very least gives you some higher bloom damage from building Elemental Mastery on Nahida. Just like I said in my Nahida guide, which you should check out if you haven't already seen it, for this team specifically, you want to build full Elemental Mastery Nahida. EM on her Sands, EM on her Goblet, and EM on her Circlet. This team is really solid at clearing AoE content, but it does suffer from one major issue. Healing through all of the bloom damage is difficult. You will take a ton of self damage, and if you don't have a solid healer, you will die. This is the main reason I opt for Kokomi and Xingqiu. Kokomi's healing is insanely good, and Xingqiu gives slight healing in addition to damage reduction. Now the downside is that to maximize this team's damage, you want Kokomi to be built Elemental Mastery, just for when she steals a bloom trigger or two. But at the same time, the damage in this team due to Nilou's buff is already so good that you don't always need to build your Hydros with Elemental Mastery. Generally, for your dedicated healer, I'd recommend building for heals as you would normally, even though it will make your damage take a bit of a dip. Something else that I want to mention is that Xingqiu allows you to proc blooms on targets that are further away, meaning to some extent you can avoid the radius of self-damage from blooms on occasion. Now, as far as rotation goes and how to play this team, you're going to want to do the following. This is what I have found to be the most effective. Nilou, skill, 2 normal attacks into skill, that's just the fastest way to get her skill out. And then you want to follow up with Nahida's elemental skill and burst. If you need to hold the skill to mark all the enemies, that's totally fine. Then you follow that up with Kokomi's elemental skill, Xingqiu's elemental skill and burst, and if you're using sacrificial sword, you can use the skill again after. And then you want to use Nahida's normal attacks. Essentially what that will do is proc a whole bunch of blooms, and using Nahida on field at the end of that is going to continue to apply Dendro to keep up with the triple Hydro and hopefully make Nahida trigger a lot of the blooms. As with most teams, there are also alternatives you can use for certain characters. For example, you can use Barbara instead of Kokomi. It's going to feel significantly worse, but you can do it. That option is there. You can also sub out Barbara for Xingqiu instead. Now, you're going to lose a lot of single target damage and a lot of Hydro application, but it can make it a lot more comfy to heal with, having the 2 healers and maybe building them both Elemental Mastery instead. The last switch you can make is basically putting in Yelan for Xingqiu. The reason I wouldn't replace Kokomi with Yelan here is because you actually do need that healing. You will destroy your own character's HP bar very quickly if you don't have a dedicated healer. All in all, this team is pretty solid, and I'm really glad that it got the buffs it needed with Nahida's release. The second team that I'm going to be showcasing today is a Hyperbloom team. Hyperbloom is when you use Hydro and Dendro to create Dendro cores and then activate them with Electro for high damage. Hyperbloom teams have about 10,000 ways that you can run them, and with Nahida's Dendro application, they've gotten even better. The example I'm showing you today is going to feature Raiden, Nahida, Xingqiu, and Zhongli, but I'll also show you some free-to-play alternatives as well. The main idea is that Raiden's Electro uptime is insane and will constantly be able to activate Nahida's Dendro application, and you'll have really solid Hyperbloom damage. You'll also have high single target damage from Xingqiu, and Zhongli will stop you from needing a dedicated healer. Overall, this team is sort of just a blast of colors. For Nahida, you'll want to build her with Elemental Mastery, Dendro damage, and crit, since she'll want to be on the field to try to help with bloom generation. So in this team, you actually want to avoid using Raiden's burst. The reason being that Nahida is able to constantly keep Dendro uptime if you use her on the field, and since Raiden's elemental skill lasts for so long, you can just keep applying Dendro with your Xingqiu applying Hydro, and Raiden will activate all of the Hyper Blooms without you needing to go into her Musou no Hitotachi state, because she is built triple EM and her damage from that will not be very high. Plus you need more blooms. As far as rotation goes in the Raiden Hyper Bloom example, you want to start off with Zhongli's elemental skill to give yourself a shield, go into Nahida's elemental skill and burst, then follow that up with Xingqiu's elemental skill, burst, and if you're on Sack Sword, skill again, and that should create a bunch of blooms. Then by using Raiden's elemental skill, that will activate all the blooms, turn them into hyper blooms, deal a whole bunch of damage, and then you can use Nahida's normal attacks to keep applying Dendro up until Xingqiu is basically ready to be used again, and then you repeat the process. Hyper Bloom is pretty straightforward, and there's an absurd amount of substitutes for teams like it. For example, if you don't want to use Raiden here, you can use Kuki instead, and you can opt to use Yelan, Fischl, Lisa, or Kokomi instead of Zhongli. If you haven't given it a try yet, I would definitely recommend trying out Kuki Hyper Bloom or Raiden Hyper Bloom with Nahida. They're a lot of fun, and honestly, it's also just kind of funny to force EM Raiden. The next team that I'm going to be talking about with you guys is a Cyno team. So if you look at Cyno, one of his biggest issues is that since he wants to be on the field so long, he needs long buff uptime to deal consistent damage. Luckily, Nahida perfectly enables Cyno teams. However, my Cyno isn't leveled on this account, so I'm using Kuching, Nahida, Fischl, and Jean instead. In this team, Kuching is dealing pretty solid electro damage, Nahida is dealing spread damage and enabling aggravates as well, Fischl is dealing tons of electro damage off field due to her Ascension 4 passive, and Jean swirls Electro to debuff enemies and also will heal up the team. Nahida's mark from her skill deals a solid chunk of damage in this team, and while it's not carrying the team, she's incredibly easy to slot in and play without putting too much thought in. I should be a rapper. For rotation, the one that I've been using is Kuching's skill, Nahida's elemental skill and burst, Fischl's skill, and then Jean's elemental skill and burst, Kuching's elemental burst, then skill and normal attacks and charged attacks, whichever is easier for you for stamina management and dodging. And then you can sort of repeat through that. If your Fischl skill is not off cooldown, you use Fischl's burst to refresh Oz. For a Cyno team, if you wanted to use it, I would recommend Cyno, Nahida, Beidou, and Kazuha. Or if you don't have Kazuha or Beidou constellations, I would recommend Jean or Sayu instead. The main reason for that is survivability. If you don't have Beidou's shield, then you don't necessarily have that much damage reduction or chance of not getting hit, so using an animal character that can heal is very valuable. Aggravate teams are a ton of fun, very easy to play, and I highly recommend you try one out if you have Kuching and want to play her, or if you like Cyno. I haven't really thought of a team name for this one, but I kind of thought it'd be funny to name it Burgeon King or something. Burgeon teams involve using a pyro character to trigger explosions with Dendro cores. Previously, it was sort of gimmicky because Dendro MC's burst would just burn up and not work if you applied pyro to it first. But with Nahida, you don't really have to worry about that happening. This essentially just means that players don't have to pay as much attention to things like rotation. Rotation absolutely helps, and I recommend learning one, but for more casual players who never cared about it in the first place, they can now reliably play Burgeon teams. Burgeon being better means that Toma is better, because Toma generates shields with every burst hit, and since Dendro cores basically make ICD not exist, Toma has the ability to trigger Burgeons often while also generating shields for your team. You'll have Kokomi for healing and Xingqiu for single target damage and more Hydro application, and Nahida on field to generate the bloom. You won't have any issues with the burning just due to the high Hydro output you'll have, and altogether it makes a pretty solid team. As always, there's substitutes for this, but first let's talk about a rotation. For this team, personally, I found it most effective to use Kokomi's elemental skill, followed by Nahida's elemental skill and burst, Xingqiu's elemental skill, burst, and skill, Toma's elemental skill and burst to funnel particles, Nahida's normal attack so that way you can proc more blooms and burgeons, and then you want to use Kokomi's elemental burst to refresh your jellyfish before the time is up, then follow it up with more Nahida normal attacks. Then you should be able to rinse and repeat. You may not actually have full uptime on Kokomi's jellyfish the next rotation, but other than that, it should be fine. If you don't have access to all of these units, or if you just want to play others, you actually have a few other options. First off, you can actually substitute Toma for Best Girl. Since her burst only triggers at most once every 2 seconds, she can reliably trigger Burgeon. She'll also give your team a passive attack buff while her burst is active, and it can be a decent alternative if you want to play Yoimiya in a Dendro team. Yoimiya is able to run Favonius, but she can also run Elegy, which will buff your team's elemental mastery, and like I said, that attack buff is pretty pretty dang good. If you decide not to do that and you still have Toma for shield, you can actually swap out Kokomi for another Hydro like Yelan or Barbara. The downside of Barbara though is that her Hydro application is a lot worse since you have to make contact with the enemy, and I really recommend avoiding using Barbara over Kokomi here. Now, the other option you have here for Burgeon is Intergrational, where it's basically a child Xiangling team with Nahida. Assuming that enemies are close enough, you can wipe content incredibly fast. You're getting AoE Burgeon damage, you're getting Riptide damage on all of the enemies, you're vaping with Xiangling, and you're buffing Child's normal attacks. It's just very strong. But you will also die incredibly fast if you don't play inside Bennett's Burst, so be aware. Highly recommend you try Burgeon. It's a lot of fun, and I think you'll like it. The fifth and final team that I want to talk about today is going to be interesting. There's this funny little mechanic in the game where if you use burning, it essentially is just refreshing the pyro aura underneath the burning aura. With Dendro units before Nahida, you couldn't use burning to reverse melt because the Dendro wouldn't be strong enough and the pyro would just go out without being refreshed. However, with Nahida, she applies 1.5 units of Dendro and constantly refreshes it. If you shoot a fully charged arrow with Ganyu, you'll get the double melt, with the melt depleting the burning aura, but not the pyro underneath it. When you activate the melt reaction, Nahida's skill will reactivate, which will restart the burning process. Basically, this means you can play Melt Ganyu without the energy issues you have for Xiangling, or without the cost of Kazuha. It's a really interesting concept and I absolutely love it. For rotation, I like to use Zhongli's elemental skill here, Bennett's elemental skill and burst, Nahida's elemental skill and burst, and then Ganyu charged attacks. But keep in mind with that rotation, you do lose some of Bennett's burst uptime. Sometimes you can go Bennett's skill, Nahida's elemental skill and burst into Bennett's burst, then use Ganyu charged attacks, and that way you'll get more buff uptime. It just sort of depends on what you prefer. Keep in mind that if you do want the burning aura to be everlasting, you do sort of need to trigger it with Nahida's elemental skill. And you're not going to have 100% uptime on burning here, but you will be able to have very consistent uptime on burning. And honestly, it feels pretty good to play Melt Ganyu with. The downside for this team is that you basically don't really have any substitutes. If you want to play Xiangling or Kazuha, you basically just replace Nahida, which takes away the entire point of this team. So I really enjoyed this team because it's like a no energy requirement to melt team, which was one of Melt Ganyu's biggest issues. Now that it's fixed up, we have a super awesome fun team. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you guys have enjoyed this video, make sure to let me know by leaving a comment down below, liking the video, and subscribing if you want to see more. If you guys are playing one of these teams, which one are you going to play? I go live a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. Definitely come check out if you want to come see some Genshin Impact and some other games as well. Until then, I'll catch you next time.